The void screamed. It was not a sound carried by air or matter, but a psychic wail that rippled through unreality itself. Stars bent like molten glass, their light twisted into spirals of madness, as a warp storm bloomed in the cold black between worlds. To mortal eyes it would have been a sight of awe and terror, a wound in the fabric of existence, pulsing like a diseased heart. To the denizens of the warp, it was an open gate, an invitation to spill forth and feast. The Imperial frigate Sanctus Gloria drifted helplessly at the storm's edge, its hull battered by impossible tides. Hymns blared from voxcasters as terrified crewmen clung to their stations, whispering prayers to the God Emperor. In the upper decks, a chaplain's voice thundered over the chaos, urging them to hold fast, to trust in the Emperor's divine will. But even his faith faltered as he gazed upon the thing blooming before them, a vortex of color and shadow, its heart a void deeper than space itself. From within that void, something moved. Not a daemon's jagged silhouette, nor a vessel of the damned, but a single figure spinning wildly, tangled in strands of glowing, ethereal thread. The web glimmered for an instant, then dissolved into nothing, leaving the figure alone as he fell. He tumbled through screaming reality, his body wrenched by forces beyond comprehension, until gravity's cruel hand finally claimed him. Peter Parker's world had ended in silence and fire. One moment he had been swinging through the familiar skyline of New York, the rush of wind against his mask and the comforting weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The next, the sky had torn open like shattered glass, a pull unlike anything he had felt before, far stronger than his spider sense, had dragged him upward, spinning his own webbing into useless tatters. Then came the fall, endless, suffocating darkness, and the sickening realization that no buildings, no streets, no home awaited him below. When he struck the ground, it was not concrete beneath him but shattered stone and ash. Peter groaned, pushing himself up on trembling arms. The air was thick with the stench of burning promethium and decay, so heavy it clung to his lungs like oil. Around him, monolithic spires rose into a sky choked by smog, their surfaces etched with symbols he didn't recognize, eagles with two heads, skulls crowned with wings, scripture carved in languages alien to his eyes. The city stretched endlessly, a maze of ruined cathedrals and factories, all cloaked in a haze that turned the horizon into a smudged line of fire. "Okay, this isn't Queens," Peter muttered beneath his breath, though his voice sounded strange, swallowed by the oppressive silence. He touched his mask, half expecting it to crumble like a dream, but it remained intact. His suit's systems flickered erratically, the HUD filling with static before dying completely. Whatever had dragged him here, it wasn't playing nice with Stark Tech. A distant boom rolled through the city like thunder. Peter froze, instincts honed by countless battles sharpening instantly. His spider sense prickled, not a sharp warning, but a dull pervasive hum, as if the very air was hostile. He crouched low, scanning the shadows between the broken buildings. Movement flickered there, brief and unsettling. Shapes that didn't move like people. "Great, definitely not Queens," he whispered. Then he heard voices. Human voices, high and frightened, carried by the wind. Peter sprinted toward them, vaulting over collapsed arches, and leaping across gaps that would have killed an ordinary man. The ground beneath him was littered with strange relics, broken statues of robed figures, rusted weapons too large for human hands, fragments of parchment that disintegrated to dust when touched. He found them huddled in the shell of what had once been a chapel, a cluster of civilians clad in rags and industrial uniforms, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. When they saw him, they screamed and recoiled. One woman crossed herself in a gesture Peter didn't recognize, babbling prayers in a harsh guttural tongue.
"Whoa, hey, I'm not here to hurt you."
Peter raised his hands, stepping back to show he wasn't a threat. I'm just as lost as you are." The words meant nothing to them. Their eyes widened, darting to the strange lenses of his mask, the sinuous black lines of his suit. To them, he must have looked like some kind of daemon or angel of war. A child began to cry. An old man spat on the ground, pointing at Peter while shouting a single word over and over. "Mute heretic. Warp-born." The air suddenly roared with a new sound, heavy engines, rhythmic and precise. Massive vehicles rumbled into the square beyond the chapel ruins. Peter peeked around a broken column and froze. The newcomers were giants clad in armor, the color of ash and blood, their helmets shaped like skulls, each one carrying weapons that looked like portable cannons. A symbol blazed on their pauldrons, the same double-headed eagle carved across the city. The civilians fell to their knees, chanting through tears. Peter's stomach twisted. Whoever these armored soldiers were, they weren't here for a friendly meet and greet. The leader gestured sharply. His voice boomed through a Vox speaker, and though Peter couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear. Search and secure. The giants spread out, methodical and terrifying. Two approached the chapel. Peter's spider sense flared, sharp and undeniable this time. Danger. He turned to the civilians, trying one last time. Please, just stay quiet. The old man screamed and pointed at him. The soldiers surged forward with inhuman speed. Peter dove aside as a burst of explosive rounds tore through the space where he had stood. The impact shattered stone and filled the chapel with fire and smoke. He coughed, ears ringing, and vaulted upward, clinging to a high beam as the giants thundered below him. Bullets, huge ones. If they hit him, even his enhanced body wouldn't stand a chance. Okay, new rule, he muttered. Don't get hit. One of the armored soldiers raised his weapon toward the beam. Peter leapt just as it disintegrated beneath a second volley. He landed outside, rolling hard. His chest ached, his mind racing. These weren't just soldiers. They were something more, bigger, faster, stronger, and they wanted him dead. As he scrambled to his feet, a shadow fell across him. The leader stood there, towering over Peter like a walking tank, his skull-faced helmet expressionless. He raised a gauntleted hand, and the soldiers ceased fire. For one heartbeat, there was silence. Then the giant spoke a single thunderous word. Chains of prayer and iron clattered as soldiers stepped forward, intent on binding the stranger from another world. The chains were cold and heavy, biting into Peter's wrists and ankles with cruel precision. Strange inscriptions were etched along each link, glowing faintly as if alive, humming with a vibration that made his skin crawl. When they tightened, it wasn't just his body that was restrained. His spider sense dulled, smothered beneath a suffocating weight that felt almost psychic. Whatever this metal was, it wasn't from his world. It didn't just bind his limbs, it bound his very instincts. The towering soldiers surrounded him in a semicircle, their skull-faced helmets gleaming in the dim light of the ruined square. Behind them, the civilians remained on their knees, whispering prayers and sobbing. To Peter's dismay, some of them looked at him with awe, others with terror. He could read nothing in their language, but he didn't need to. To them he wasn't a man, he was a sign, a portent, something to be feared or worshipped. The leader barked an order, and Peter was hauled to his feet by two of the armored giants. Even restrained, he struggled instinctively, his muscles coiling and twisting with superhuman strength. But the soldiers barely seemed to note. Their grip was unyielding, their sheer size and power overwhelming. They marched him forward like a prisoner of war, each footstep reverberating through the cracked streets like the toll of a funeral bell. As they moved deeper into the city, Peter's senses drank in the alien world around him. The streets were wide, lined with towering structures that blended industrial brutality with religious reverence. Massive statues of robed figures loomed from the shadows, their stony eyes gazing down in eternal judgment. The smell of smoke and burning oil was everywhere, clinging to his tongue and throat. Fires guttered in broken shrines, their flames struggling against a sky choked with smog, so thick it turned day into perpetual twilight. The deeper they went, the more Peter realized the scale of this place. This wasn't a city in the way New York was a city. It was a fortress, a machine, a cathedral built to house millions under one suffocating faith. Everywhere he looked, symbols of the double-headed eagle stared back at him, carved into walls, banners, even the armor of his captor. This was no simple government or military, it was something far older, far more absolute. They passed groups of civilians who stopped their labors to stare, falling to their knees at the sight of the armored soldier. When their eyes turned to Peter, their expressions twisted with confusion and fear. Some spat in disgust, others crossed themselves reverently, whispering frantic prayers. Peter kept his head down, shame burning in his chest. He wanted to tell them he wasn't their enemy, that he wasn't here to hurt them, but his voice would mean nothing to them. His words were as alien as his presence. The procession crossed a vast bridge of black iron, suspended over a chasm, filled with machinery that throbbed and groaned like a living thing. Steam hissed from vents, and somewhere far below, Peter thought he heard the rhythmic pounding of colossal hammers. The noise mingled with the low, haunting chants of distant choirs. This city didn't just produce smoke and metal, it produced faith. Eventually, they reached a towering structure at the heart of the hive. It rose higher than any skyscraper Peter had ever seen, its spires stabbing at the heavens like knives. Enormous stained glass windows glowed faintly from within, depicting scenes of battle and divine judgment. At its gates a crowd had gathered, kept at bay by lines of grim-faced soldiers clad in simpler armor than the giants. These men and women carried long rifles and bore the same eagle sigil on their breastplates. As Peter was dragged through the crowd, the shouting began. The language was foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. Rage, fear, accusation. Hands reached toward him, some clutching relics, others stones. A rock struck his shoulder and bounced harmlessly off his suit, but the intent stung far worse. They didn't see him as a hero, they saw him as a monster. Inside, the structure was even more overwhelming. The ceilings soared impossibly high, lost in shadows pierced by shafts of golden light. Incense burned in massive braziers, filling the air with a choking, acrid sweetness. Rows of candles flickered before altars adorned with skulls and holy symbols. Every surface was carved with prayers, every wall a tapestry of devotion and war. Peter felt small here and insignificant, a speck in the machinery of a faith so vast and alien it made his head spin. The soldiers brought him before a raised dais, where a figure in flowing black robes awaited. This man was not armored like the others, but his presence was no less commanding. His face was pale and hawk-like, his eyes cold and piercing. He carried a staff topped with a metallic symbol that glimmered with restrained power. The robed man studied Peter for a long moment before speaking. His voice was smooth but edged with steel, carrying easily through the hall. Though Peter couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear enough. Judgment. Peter tried to speak, his voice hoarse. Look, I don't know who you are or what you think I've done, but I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to get home. The man's expression didn't change. He gestured sharply. The chains around Peter's limbs constricted, forcing him to his knees. Pain shot through his body, white-hot and paralyzing. He gasped, his vision swimming. The robed man stepped closer, speaking again. His tone was calm, almost curious, but beneath it lurked menace. Peter didn't need to understand the words to grasp their weight. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an interrogation. The armored soldiers withdrew to the edges of the chamber, leaving Peter alone beneath the man's gaze. Somewhere deep within the hive, a bell tolled, its mournful chime echoing through the cathedral like a death knell, and in that moment, Peter realized something chilling. Whatever trial awaited him here, it would not be one of justice, it would be one of survival. The chains dragged Peter forward across the cold stone floor, their metallic clatter echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling like a mocking hymn. He stumbled but didn't fall, though each step sent a jolt of pain through his shoulders and spine. The robed figure walked ahead in measured silence, his hands clasped behind his back, flanked by two towering armored soldiers, who moved with mechanical precision. The air was heavy with incense, and the faint, sour tang of blood. Somewhere deep in the cathedral's depths, chanting rose and fell like the tide, an endless prayer that blurred into the low hum of machinery. Peter's breathing was ragged beneath his mask. He was trying to stay calm, to think, to plan a way out, but every time he flexed his muscles, the chains tightened, humming with that strange psychic weight that crushed not only his strength, but his very instincts. It was like his spider sense had been gagged and bound, leaving him blind to danger. The loss was disorienting, terrifying in a way he hadn't expected. For years that extra sense had been his lifeline. Now, it was gone. The procession descended into the bowels of the structure,
The walls here were close and damp, carved from ancient stone and reinforced with black iron. Flickering torches cast grotesque shadows that writhed like living things. Peter's mind kept drifting to the people he'd seen outside, the terror in their eyes, the desperate prayers. This wasn't just a city under siege, it was a city consumed by fear, its entire culture built around surviving in a nightmare. They reached a chamber so vast it seemed impossible it could exist underground. Iron pillars rose like the trunks of dead trees, supporting a ceiling lost in darkness. At the center was a raised platform surrounded by concentric rings of robed figures. Their faces were hidden by hoods, their hands clasped in fervent devotion. The smell of incense was overwhelming here, thick enough to sting Peter's eye. The robed figure leading Peter stepped onto the platform and turned, finally addressing the assembly in a voice that carried like a blade cutting through mist. Though Peter couldn't understand the language, the cadence was unmistakable. Accusation. Each word landed like a hammer blow, met with answering cries from the surrounding priests. Some sounded fearful, others triumphant, as if this moment had been prophesied. Peter's stomach twisted. He was being judged for crimes he didn't even know existed. The leader gestured toward him. 2 soldiers forced Peter to his knees. A circle of symbols was etched into the stone beneath him, glowing faintly with the same strange energy as his chains. As he struggled, one of the priests stepped forward carrying a metal rod, topped with a miniature eagle. The priest pressed the burning tip against Peter's chest. Even through his suit, the heat was unbearable. Peter screamed, his voice echoing through the chamber. The crowd answered with a single unified chant. The sound shook the air, rattling Peter's bones. Whatever ritual this was, it wasn't just ceremony, it had power, real power. When the chanting subsided, the leader spoke again. His voice was calm now, almost soft. He knelt before Peter, studying him with cold analytical eye. Slowly, deliberately, he removed one of Peter's lenses, exposing his left eye. The sudden exposure made Peter flinch. The man searched his gaze, as though looking for something hidden deep inside. Peter swallowed hard, forcing out words he knew wouldn't be understood. "I'm not what you think I am. I'm just a guy trying to help people." The leader tilted his head, clearly recognizing the tone if not the meaning. He replied with a phrase that sounded almost like pity. Then he rose and gave an order. 2 of the armored soldiers stepped forward carrying a massive object between them, a tome bound in cracked leather and edged with steel. They set it on a stand before Peter and opened it to reveal pages filled with intricate symbols and illustrations. The leader began to read aloud, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. The words were alien, but Peter didn't need a translator to feel the weight of them. This was more than history, this was doctrine. Images on the pages caught his eye. Monstrous creatures, with too many limbs, shadowy figures, with burning eyes, great armies, locked in endless war, and among them, images of beings that looked eerily like him, or at least, like what these people believed him to be. A figure descending from the sky wrapped in strands of light, bringing destruction wherever it went. Realization dawned like ice in Peter's veins. They didn't see him as a hero, they saw him as a herald of doom. Suddenly, the ground trembled. A deep guttural roar echoed through the chamber, shaking dust from the high ceiling. The priests gasped and fell silent. The soldiers snapped to attention, weapons raised. The leader barked orders, his calm shattered. Peter's spider sense flickered weakly, like a candle struggling against a storm. It wasn't gone anymore. It was screaming, faint but urgent. Chaos erupted as another roar split the air, this one closer. Distant screams reached Peter's ears, followed by the staccato rattle of gunfire. Something terrible was happening above. In the confusion, one of the soldiers turned toward the noise, momentarily loosening his grip on Peter's chain. Peter's instincts flared. This was his only chance. He surged upward, twisting his body and yanking the chain taut. The motion sent the soldier sprawling. Before the others could react, Peter dove toward the edge of the glowing circle. The moment he crossed its boundary, the psychic weight around him lifted slightly. His spider sense surged back to life, still muffled, but strong enough to guide him. He didn't think, he moved, sprinting toward the nearest archway as bolts of explosive fire tore through the air behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Whatever was coming for this city, It was bad enough to terrify even these giants, and somewhere deep inside, Peter knew this was only the beginning. Peter sprinted through the labyrinthine tunnels, his breath ragged, every step echoing against the ancient stone like the heartbeat of some buried titan. Behind him, the guttural voices of the armored soldiers thundered orders through vox speakers, their heavy boots pounding closer. His spider sense flared erratically, fragments of warning blurring together into a storm of panic. He had been in countless life or death fights before, but never like this. These weren't criminals or supervillains. These were zealots armed with weapons that could turn a man into red mist. With a single pull of the trigger, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber lit by towering braziers. A vast metal gate loomed ahead, its surface etched with scripture and images of war. As Peter neared it, the gate ground open with a deafening roar, revealing a space beyond so vast it seemed impossible. It had been built by mortal hands. The air shimmered with heat and the smell of oil, blood and old battles. He didn't have time to question it. The soldiers drove him forward at gunpoint, their massive forms hemming him in on all sides. The gate clanged shut behind them, sealing Peter. The chamber stretched like an arena, circular as Ayla, untiered. High above, crowds of robed citizens filled the seats, their faces hidden by shadow and flickering torchlight. Their voices melded into a low, fervent chant. Peter's chest tightened. This wasn't an escape. This was a spectacle. At the far end stood the skull-faced giant, who had first captured him. The leader removed his helmet, revealing a face scarred and pale, his eyes as cold and unyielding as the city itself. Beside him was the robed inquisitor Peter had faced earlier, his expression calm but watchful, like a man studying a dangerous specimen. The inquisitor spoke, his voice amplified by some unseen device, so that it filled the arena. Peter couldn't understand the words, but their intent was unmistakable. A trial, a test. 2 soldiers approached Peter, cutting the chains from his wrists and ankles. For a brief second, he felt free, his spider sense roaring back to full strength. But before he could act, a massive portcullis slammed open on the opposite side of the arena. From the darkness beyond, something emerged. The creature was a nightmare given flesh, a hulking mutant, its skin a patchwork of scars and tumors, its limbs twisted and misshapen. A metal collar studded with spikes encircled its thick neck, chains dragging behind it. The crowd roared in approval, their chanting rising to a fever pitch. The mutant's breath came in guttural snarls, its eyes burning with mindless rage. Peter's stomach dropped. They were throwing him into a fight. The inquisitor gestured sharply. The skull-faced leader raised a weapon unlike anything Peter had ever seen. A massive gun, more like a handheld cannon, with a barrel etched in scripture. Its presence radiated power, the kind of destructive force that could level buildings. Peter realized with horror that it wasn't for the mutant, it was for him. Trial by combat, Peter muttered, his voice dry. Figures. The mutant charged, the ground trembling beneath its bulk. Peter's instincts screamed. He leapt high, flipping over the creature's swinging claws. His web shooters clicked uselessly. Empty. He'd burned through his last cartridges back home, and this world had no replacements. That left only his strength, speed, and he landed behind the mutant, and kicked with all his might. The impact staggered it, but didn't drop it. Its hide was like armor, its muscles corded with unnatural strength. Peter ducked as the creature swung wildly, then rolled to the side, searching for an opening. The crowd roared louder, some screaming in praise, others in anger. A searing pain lanced across his shoulder. Peter glanced up to see the skull-faced leader, aiming his massive weapon directly at him. The trial wasn't just about fighting the mutant, it was about surviving under fire. The bolt weapon boomed, the explosive round detonating where Peter had been a heartbeat earlier. Stone and ash erupted around him, showering his mask with debris. "Are you kidding me?" Peter shouted, diving for cover. His voice was lost in the deafening noise. The mutant pressed its attack relentlessly, driving Peter back toward the center of the arena. Every move he made was shadowed by the Space Marine's fire, each explosive bolt a hammer blow meant to test him. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He remembered Aunt May's words, echoing through his mind. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. Even here, in this hellish place, that truth held. If he gave up now, he'd die, and worse, he'd leave this world to whatever horrors stalked it. He feinted left, then darted right, drawing the mutant into a stumble. As it fell forward, Peter vaulted onto its back, wrapping his arms around its thick neck. With a guttural cry, he twisted, using every ounce of his strength. There was a sickening crack. The mutant collapsed, unmoving. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then the crowd erupted into a cacophony of chants and screams. Some voices praised him, others cursed him. None offered understanding. Peter stood over the corpse, his chest heaving, his suit torn and scorched. The skull-faced leader lowered his weapon, but did not step forward. The Inquisitor approached instead, his hands folded calmly. He studied Peter for a long moment before speaking a single word. Soldiers closed in around Peter once more, their weapons ready but not aimed. It wasn't the hostility of capture this time, it was acknowledgement. Peter had passed their test, but as they bound his wrists again, the Inquisitor's cold eyes never left his face. Whatever came next, Peter knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere beyond this arena, in the smog-choked city above, something far worse was waiting to strike. The taste of ash lingered in Peter's mouth as he was led from the arena, his wrists once again bound by the humming chain. His legs trembled with exhaustion, every muscle screaming from the brutal fight, but he kept moving. Stopping now would be seen as weakness, and weakness, in this place, was an invitation to die. The crowd's chanting faded behind him, replaced by the rhythmic clanking of machinery as the soldiers escorted him deeper into the hive. The air grew hotter and denser, heavy with metallic tang and acrid fumes that burned his throat. They descended a spiraling ramp carved into the living rock, the glow of molten light rising from far below. Strange, insect-like machines scuttled across the walls, their limbs clicking as they performed maintenance on the vast mechanisms embedded in the stone. The sounds were unnerving, whispers of gears and the hiss of steam punctuated by distant haunting prayers carried through vox speakers. Peter's mind whirled. He had fought monsters before, but the mutant in the arena had been something else. It wasn't just strength or rage, it was corruption given form, and the soldiers who had tested him weren't simple warriors. They were more like living weapons, their every movement precise, their sheer presence radiating dominance. If they were this world's defenders, then what kind of threats could they possibly be defending against? They reached a colossal gate wrought from blackened steel and covered in glowing script. The Inquisitor, walking ahead, spoke a command, and the gate slowly parted with a grinding roar. A wave of heat blasted Peter's face. Beyond lay a cavernous forge hall that stretched so far he couldn't see the walls. Furnaces belched fire into the darkness. Vast crucibles of molten metal hung suspended from chains thicker than tree trunks. Giant humanoid silhouettes moved amidst the smoke, their forms revealed to be robed figures of the Adeptus Mechanicus, part human, part machine. Their faces were obscured by brass masks, and their limbs were a grotesque mix of flesh and mechanical augmentation. Tubes and wires snaked into their bodies, connecting them to the machinery around them, like parasitic veins. Peter's heart raced. These weren't simply engineers, they were something far stranger. The Inquisitor gestured, and the soldiers shoved Peter forward toward a raised dais, surrounded by Mechanicus priests. A massive slab of metal rose from the floor, its surface etched with runes and clamps, clearly designed to hold a body immobile. Peter backed up instinctively. Whoa, no thanks, you're not strapping me to that thing. The Inquisitor didn't understand his words, but his cold smile said he understood Peter's fear. He nodded once, and the soldiers seized Peter, forcing him onto the slab. The clamps snapped shut, locking him down. His spider strength strained against them, but they didn't budge. Whatever metal they were made of, it wasn't from his world. The forge priests began chanting, their voices mechanical and monotone, as if reciting an ancient code. From the shadows emerged a towering figure, half man, half machine, its body bristling with surgical instruments, and servo arms tipped with saws and needles. Its mask was a featureless plate of bronze etched with binary symbols. Peter's breath quickened. Oh no, this is mad scientist territory. This is Frankenstein on steroids. The figure leaned over him, a dozen mechanical limbs hovering like predators above their prey. A spike of ice-cold fear shot through Peter as his spider sense screamed. He struggled wildly, but the restraints held firm. The Inquisitor spoke softly to the Mechanicus figure, gesturing toward Peter. The word, Astartes, was repeated several times. Peter froze at that unfamiliar term. The Inquisitor looked at him, almost reverently, and placed a gauntleted hand on Peter's chest. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word as though offering a prophecy. Then he stepped back. The forge priest went to work. Needles plunged into Peter's veins, pumping strange glowing fluids into his bloodstream. A searing heat spread through his body, accompanied by a crawling, tearing sensation beneath his skin. His back arched involuntarily, a strangled cry tearing from his throat. His vision blurred. The world became a haze of light and agony.
Images flashed through his mind, memories of swinging through New York, of Aunt May's smile, of MJ's laughter, only to shatter into fragments as the pain drowned them out. His muscles convulsed, his bones grinding and reshaping. It felt like his body was being rewritten at the molecular level, as if something alien was trying to overwrite who he was. The chanting grew louder, the binary voices merging with the hiss of steam and the clanging of machinery. Servo arms cut into his flesh, inserting strange organs and implants. Peter caught glimpses of metal cylinders filled with writhing organic matter, their contents fused into his body without hesitation. Through the haze he understood. They weren't torturing him. They were transforming him. The words spoken earlier returned to him. Astartes. The armored soldiers who had captured him weren't merely men. They were these Astartes, these space marines, and the priests were trying to make him one of them. Peter's thoughts real. They were rewriting his very being, reshaping him to fight wars he couldn't comprehend. His spider strength clashed violently with the invasive changes. His unique physiology adapted to radiation, toxins and venom, was both resisting and embracing the transformation. The result was chaos. His veins burned like fire, his heartbeat thundered like war drums, and his vision shifted between crystal clarity and utter darkness. Suddenly, one of the servo arms jammed a device into the base of his skull. His world exploded in white light. A flood of foreign memories and instincts surged into his mind, tactical patterns, battle drills, hymns of war. He screamed, trying to hold on to himself as the torrent threatened to drown him. "No," he rasped, fighting to remember who he was. "I'm Peter Parker. I'm Spider-Man." The name anchored him for a heartbeat, a fragile thread amidst the storm. Then the pain stopped. Peter lay trembling, drenched in sweat and blood, his chest heaving. The clamps released with a hiss, and he collapsed to the forge floor. His body felt alien, heavier yet stronger. His muscles thrummed with new power, and his senses were sharper than ever before. Every breath of air carried layers of information, scents of oil, metal, fear. Every distant sound was crisp and clear. The Inquisitor knelt beside him, eyes gleaming with something between triumph and calculation. He spoke one word, "Brother." Peter's gaze darted to a polished metal surface nearby. His reflection stared back, his mask torn away, his face pale and drawn, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. He barely recognized himself, and deep in his chest, beneath the thrum of new organs and alien strength, Peter felt a single horrifying truth settle into place. He wasn't just in their world anymore. He was becoming part of it. Peter staggered as he was led out of the forge hall, his vision swimming with heat and ghostly after-images. Every movement felt strange, as though his body no longer belonged entirely to him. His senses had sharpened beyond anything he'd experienced before, even more intense than his spider sense. He could hear the mechanical hiss of the soldiers' armor joints, smell the faint tang of blood beneath the overwhelming perfume of incense, and feel the weight of their footsteps through the very stone beneath his boots. It was overwhelming, almost nauseating, and yet there was a terrifying clarity to it, like standing on the edge of a cliff and seeing the entire world spread below. The Inquisitor walked ahead with measured strides, his black robes whispering over the ground. Around them, the deep hum of machinery gave way to the rhythmic march of troops and the rising clamor of voices. Peter blinked, his altered eyes adjusting to the harsh glow of torchlight and industrial lamps as they emerged into a colossal courtyard open to the smog-choked sky. Beyond the massive gates lay a hive city in chaos. Smoke billowed from shattered towers, drifting across the horizon like storm clouds. Sirens wailed in the distance, mingling with the deep tolling of cathedral bells. Peter's heightened hearing caught snippets of panicked shouts, the barked orders of officers, the mechanical growl of engines. Far off, something massive roared, a sound so alien and guttural that it sent a chill racing down his spine. Lines of Imperial guardsmen filled the square, their armor dull and utilitarian compared to the ornate giants who flanked Peter. They moved with grim efficiency, forming ranks beneath banners emblazoned with the double-headed eagle. Their faces were hard, their eyes haunted. These were not soldiers fighting for glory. These were men and women fighting because there was no other choice. Peter's captors brought him before a towering transport vehicle, its surface covered in purity seals and scripture. The Inquisitor turned to him, speaking in sharp, clipped tones, then gestured toward the battlefield beyond the city gates. The meaning was clear enough. Peter wasn't just being taken to witness the fight, he was expected to join it. Peter shook his head. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not." He stopped, realizing again that his words were useless here. No one understood him. No one cared what he wanted. The Inquisitor's expression hardened. He barked a single command. The Space Marines surrounding Peter raised their massive bolters in unison, the gesture leaving no room for misinterpretation. Fight or die. Peter's hands curled into fists. His pulse thundered in his ears. Back home, he'd always chosen to fight because it was the right thing to do. Here, he was being forced. The difference twisted in his gut, but there was no time to dwell on it. A sudden explosion tore through the city walls, showering the courtyard with stone and fire. The air filled with a chorus of screams and the roar of engines. Through the breach poured creatures from a nightmare. They were humanoid only in the vaguest sense, their bodies twisted and mutated, their skin a patchwork of scales, horns and chit. Some carried crude weapons, others fought with claws and teeth, their howls blending into a single, mindless roar. Behind them lumbered larger beasts, hulking monstrosities that moved like living siege engines. The stench of them hit Peter like a physical blow. Rot, sulfur, and something fouler, something wrong. The guardsmen opened fire, their rifles spitting red beams into the oncoming horde. The creatures fell in heaps, but for every one that dropped, two more surged forward. The Space Marines moved like gods among mortals, their bolters roaring thunder, each shot a miniature explosion that ripped through flesh and stone alike. The ground trembled beneath their advance. Peter stood frozen for a single heartbeat, horror rooting him in place. Then instinct took over. His newly altered body surged with power as he leapt high into the air, landing atop the breached wall. The jump was effortless, higher and faster than anything he'd managed before. His new strength was staggering, almost frightening. He could feel the weight of the battle beneath his feet, every vibration mapping itself through his senses. He didn't have web shooters anymore, but his reflexes were sharper than ever. When a mutated beast lunged at a cluster of terrified civilians, Peter dropped from the wall and struck like lightning. His fist connected with a sickening crunch, sending the creature sprawling. The civilians stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, before fleeing towards safety. A second monster came at him from behind. His spider sense screamed, and he spun, delivering a kick that shattered its jaw. Blood sprayed across the cobblestones, dark and steaming. For a moment, Peter could almost pretend he was back home, saving lives the way he always had. But then he saw the guardsmen. One squad had been cornered by a towering brute with a serrated blade for an arm. The guardsmen fought bravely, their last fire cutting through lesser foes. But they were no match for the beast. It cleaved through their line, sending bodies flying. The survivors didn't retreat. They stood their ground, chanting prayers, even as death closed in. Peter's chest tightened. This wasn't like New York, where retreat was an option. Here, surrender meant extermination. These people fought not just for themselves, but for their entire world. He hurled himself forward, colliding with the brute in a blur of motion. The impact drove the creature back,
but it recovered quickly, roaring in rage. They traded blows in a flurry of violence, Peter's speed barely keeping him ahead of the monster's sheer power. At last, he drove both hands into its chest and ripped, the unnatural strength of his new body tearing it apart in a spray of gore. The guardsmen stared at him, their faces a mixture of awe and suspicion. One of them raised a trembling hand, sketching a symbol in the air, as if warding off evil. Peter realized they didn't see him as a hero. They didn't even see him as human. To them he was just another weapon, another monster, unleashed in service of their war. A deep horn blared across the battlefield, cutting through the clash of combat. The Inquisitor's voice boomed over loudspeakers, issuing commands Peter couldn't understand. The Space Marines shifted formation, pushing forward to drive the enemy back toward the breach. Peter stood amidst the chaos, his chest heaving, the stench of blood thick in his nose. He had saved lives, yes, but he had also killed, brutally and without hesitation. And as the sunless sky darkened further, lit only by fire and muzzle flashes, a chilling realization crept into his mind. This battle wasn't the end, it was only his initiation. The Imperium had given him no choice but to fight, and now they had seen his strength. Whatever came next, they would expect more, so much more. The battlefield stank of blood and burned flesh. Smoke curled in heavy, suffocating sheets across the ruins of the Hive City's outer wall, turning the already dark sky into a choking void. Peter stood amidst the wreckage, his hands slick with alien gore, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. The enemy had been repelled, but not destroyed. The breach was sealed for now, yet he could feel it in the marrow of his bones. This was only a temporary reprieve. Around him, the surviving guardsmen moved with grim purpose, dragging away bodies both living and dead. Medics knelt beside the wounded, whispering prayers even as they worked. The Space Marines stood like statues at the perimeter, their bolters resting against their armored thighs, their silent vigilance more unnerving than the roar of battle. The Inquisitor strode among them, issuing commands in his clipped, sharp voice. Every word was iron authority, every glance enough to send soldiers scurrying. Peter didn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. There would be no rest. The war never truly stopped here. He turned away, trying to steady his breathing, but his enhanced senses betrayed him. They fed him everything, every moan of the dying, every sobbed prayer, every clatter of boots on stone. It was too much. His spider sense, once his guide and protector, had become something different since the transformation. It wasn't just warning him of danger anymore, it was whispering. At first, he thought it was the wind, carrying scraps of broken sound through the smoke. But as he stood still, he realized the whispers weren't external at all. They were inside his mind, threading through his thoughts like spider silk. Peter Parker, the voice was faint, distorted, as though spoken from 1,000 miles away. You do not belong here.
He spun in place, fists raised, but there was nothing, only the wreckage and the distant glow of fires. No one else seemed to hear it. The guardsmen continued their work without pause, the Space Marines unmoved. Peter's breath quickened. Who's there? His voice cracked, swallowed by the din of the battlefield. No answer came, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew clearer, more insistent, their tone shifting between soothing and sinister. Save them all, or burn with them. He clutched his head, fighting to push the words out. They weren't his thoughts, they didn't feel like his memories, and yet part of him recognized them, like an echo of a nightmare he'd forgotten. A gauntleted hand landed on his shoulder. Peter flinched violently, spinning to see one of the Space Marines towering over him. The warrior's skull-faced helmet was unreadable, but the gesture was strangely steadying. The Marine said nothing, merely tilting his head toward the Inquisitor. Peter understood. He was being summoned. Reluctantly he followed, forcing himself to focus on the physical world. The whispers faded but did not disappear. They lingered at the edge of his mind like a spider lurking in a dark corner, waiting to strike. The Inquisitor led him through the wrecked streets, past squads of guardsmen fortifying their position. Statues of robed figures loomed over them, their faces cracked and weathered, but still radiating judgment. Entire blocks of buildings were rubble, the air thick with ash. Peter caught glimpses of civilians hiding in the ruins, their hollow eyes following him with a mixture of awe and terror. Finally, they reached a plaza at the heart of the district. A massive reliquary stood there, its walls covered in scripture and sigils that glowed faintly in the dark. This was clearly a place of spiritual significance. The Inquisitor spoke to Peter, his voice low but intense, his hands gesturing toward the horizon. Though Peter couldn't understand the words, he felt the urgency behind them. This wasn't over. The creatures that had attacked were only the vanguard of something far greater. Peter glanced past him, toward the distant battlefield. His spider sense spiked violently, a surge of pure, searing dread. He staggered, clutching his head as the whispers roared back, louder than ever. "The veil is thinning. The warp is here," he gasped, dropping to one knee. Images flooded his mind, visions of writhing shadows, endless hordes of clawed abominations, cities consumed by fire and madness. Towering demons loomed above oceans of blood, their laughter like breaking glass. The smell of sulfur and rot filled his nostrils, though he knew it wasn't real. When the vision cleared, Peter found himself on his back, staring up at the smog-choked sky. The Inquisitor stood over him, speaking urgently to the Space Marines. One of them handed him a small, skull-shaped device, which he pressed to Peter's temple. A sudden coldness swept through Peter's mind, dulling the whispers. The relief was immediate, but incomplete. The Inquisitor studied him, his eyes narrowing. There was no pity there, only calculation. Peter sat up slowly, shaken. He realized what was happening. His spider sense wasn't just reacting to danger anymore. It was reacting to the warp itself, the chaotic, nightmarish dimension that bled into this reality. The transformation he had undergone hadn't just made him stronger, it had opened him to things no human was meant to perceive. The Inquisitor spoke again, this time pointing at Peter's chest, then at the city beyond. The meaning was clear enough. Peter was to be their weapon against what was coming. Peter's stomach twisted. Back home, he'd chosen to fight because he believed in protecting people. Here there was no choice. The Imperium didn't ask for heroes, it forged them out of fear and necessity. As they prepared to move out, a new sound rolled across the city, a deep, reverberating hum that set Peter's teeth on edge. The sky flickered, streaks of unnatural light tearing through the clouds. The warp storm was intensifying, its influence bleeding into the material world. The whispers surged again, nearly drowning out his thoughts. "Join us," they hissed. "All threads lead to the same way." Peter clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand. He couldn't let it take him. He couldn't lose himself here, not now. A sudden explosion shattered the plaza's edge, throwing guardsmen and rubble into the air. Through the smoke poured a new wave of creatures, larger and more twisted than before. Their howls were maddened, frenzied, and unmistakably intelligent. The Inquisitor barked an order. The Space Marines moved instantly, forming a protective wall around the relic. Peter leapt into action, his mind a blur of instinct and defiance. He would fight, he would save whoever he could. But deep inside, the whispering voice laughed softly, like silk tearing. "You are already ours. And as Peter drove his fist through the skull of the first creature, he wondered if it was telling the truth. The battlefield dissolved into darkness. One moment Peter was driving his fist through the creature's skull, the next his senses was swallowed by a blinding rush of light and noise that wasn't truly sound. It was like being dragged through every nightmare he'd ever had at once. His body twisted and contorted in impossible directions, yet he felt no pain, only the sickening sensation of falling sideways, of being pulled along strands of unseen threads. The voices in his head rose to a deafening pitch, 1,000 whispers, chanting in unison, all speaking his name. And then, silence. Peter hit the ground hard, rolling across smooth stone. His instincts flared, and he sprang to his feet in a crouch, ready to fight. But there was no enemy here, no smoke or fire, no broken hive city. Instead, he stood in a vast chamber, lit by a pale, otherworldly glow. Towering shelves stretched upward into infinity, packed with tomes, scrolls, and artifacts that pulsed faintly with an inner light.
The air shimmered as if reality itself was fragile, barely holding together. It wasn't a library in the way Peter understood it. It was alive. He turned in a slow circle, his breath catching. This place was impossibly massive, its dimensions shifting subtly as he moved, like a spider's web viewed through water. His spider sense was in overdrive, buzzing so sharply it bordered on pain. Something about this place set it screaming. A whisper brushed against his thoughts, but this one was different, clear, deliberate, focused. "You should not be here, outsider." Peter spun toward the sound and froze. Figures emerged from the shimmering air, tall and impossibly graceful, their movements as fluid as flowing water. They wore ornate armor etched with symbols he didn't recognize, their faces concealed by masks, shaped like elongated, alien skulls. Each carried a curved blade or a staff crowned with glowing crystal. For a moment Peter thought they were enemies, then he noticed how they didn't advance to strike. They stood at a measured distance, their posture wary, like hunters confronting an unpredictable animal. The leader stepped forward, its voice a soft echo in his mind. "You are not of this galaxy, not of this war, yet you are tangled in its threads." Peter swallowed, trying to steady his breathing. "I don't know how I got here. One second I was fighting, the next boom. Weird cosmic teleport thing. Look, if you can hear me in my head, maybe you can help me get home." The figure tilted its head, as though studying him. Home. The word carried layers of meaning Peter couldn't fully grasp. "You speak of another reality entirely, that is, beyond even our craft. But you are dangerous, and so is the web that brought you here." Behind the leader, other figures murmured in their alien tongue. The sound was musical, haunting, like a dirge sung for worlds long dead. Peter gestured around them. "What is this place? Where am I?" "The Black Library," the leader replied, "a repository of all that was, is, and may yet be, knowledge forbidden even to the mightiest of your Imperium. We walk between strands of time and fate, guarding against the ruin that hungers beyond." Peter's heart pounded. He didn't understand half of what was being said, but he understood enough. This wasn't just a library, it was a map of the universe's hidden truth, and somehow he had been dragged right into the center of it. The leader's gaze sharpened. "The warp storm that carried you here was not random. It was a snare, woven by powers older than your species. You are a catalyst, a thread of fate from another tapestry entirely, and now you are caught in the war that devours this galaxy." Peter's hands curled into fists. "So what do I do? Just stand back while everyone gets slaughtered? I'm not built for that. Back home, His voice caught. The image of Aunt May, of MJ, of swinging through New York skyscrapers, flashed before him like a blade through his heart. "Back home, I had people who needed me. I saved lives. That's what I do." The leader's tone softened, but only slightly. "And that is why you are dangerous. Your presence disrupts the balance. You are not bound by the threads that govern this galaxy. If left unchecked, you could unravel everything." Peter stepped closer, his voice rising. "Then help me fix it. Help me fight whatever's causing this warp storm, before it destroys more people, before it destroys me." A long pause followed. The alien warriors shifted uneasily, their armor whispering against the smooth stone. Finally, the leader inclined its head. "Very well. Know this, outsider. Chaos is not merely war or destruction. It is temptation, madness, the corruption of will. If you would face it, you must understand the web you are caught within." The chamber around them shifted, the shelves dissolving into images, worlds burning, titanic battles fought across void and land, gods of nightmare towering over mortal armies. Peter stumbled back as the visions assaulted him, space marines falling in endless war, daemons feasting on souls, entire planets consumed by writhing storms of unreality. Through it all, one thread shone brighter than the rest, a crimson strand that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. It connected him to everything he saw, stretching into the warp storm that had brought him here. Peter reached for it instinctively. The leader's voice snapped sharply in his mind. "Do not touch it." The vision vanished. Peter fell to his knees, gasping. His hands shook. What was that?" "Your fate," the leader said simply, "and the fate of many others. The storm was drawn to you, because you are different, unbound, Others seek to use that difference to tear open a path for their dark god. They will not stop. You are the key they need. Peter stared at the alien figure, cold dread settling in his gut. So I'm not just stuck here, I'm a target, and a weapon, the leader confirmed. Choose wisely which you become. Before Peter could respond, the chamber shuddered violently. A rift tore open in the air, spilling raw warp energy like liquid fire. Shadows screamed as armored figures burst through, chaos warriors clad in black and crimson, their eyes glowing with hate. The leader's voice rang sharp. They have found us. The choice is made for now. Run. Hands seized Peter, dragging him backward as battle erupted around him. Blades clashed. Psychic fire split the darkness, and the Black Library itself seemed to writhe in pain. As they fled through a collapsing archway, Peter glanced back and saw the crimson thread trailing from his chest into the rift, stretching endlessly into the void, and for the first time, he understood just how tangled this web truly was. The world snapped back into focus with a violent lurch, and Peter collapsed onto rough stone, his body slamming against cold metal plates. He rolled to his knees, gasping, his limbs trembling as though every nerve had been set alight. The chaotic visions of the Black Library clung to his mind like spider silk, their images refusing to fade. He could still see the crimson thread stretching from his chest into the storm, a haunting reminder that he was not merely lost. He was being hunted. A hand seized his shoulder, hauling him upright. One of the Space Marines loomed over him, its skull-faced helmet gleaming in the half-light. Behind the Marine, Imperial guardsmen rushed past, shouting orders, their boots pounding against the ferrocrust. Peter staggered to his feet, barely catching himself before he fell again. His body was stronger than it had ever been, yet his mind felt frayed, stretched thin between realities. The Inquisitor stood at the edge of a raised platform, overlooking the Hive's central district. Fires burned on every horizon, sending towers of black smoke spiraling into the sky. The air was thick with the smell of ash, oil, and fear. Civilians clustered in the streets below, herded by squads of soldiers barking commands. Some carried children, others dragged bundles of meager possessions. They moved like the living dead, hollow-eyed and silent, except for the occasional sob or whispered prayer. Peter's heart clenched. He had seen disaster zones before, fires, collapsed buildings, riots, but this was different. This was a city living under constant siege, where survival was a matter of faith and luck. The Inquisitor turned, his gaze sharp and cold. He gestured toward Peter, then swept his hand toward the crowd below. The meaning was clear. These people were a liability. Too many mouths to feed, too many bodies to protect. In the Imperium's brutal calculus, they were a weakness that could doom the defense of the Hive. Peter shook his head immediately. No, no way. They're civilian. They're terrified. They're hurt. They need help. Not, whatever you're planning. The Inquisitor didn't understand his words, but he understood the defiance in Peter's tone. His eyes narrowed, his lips curling into something close to contempt. He barked a command. Alarms wailed as squads of guardsmen moved into position around the plaza, heavy weapons glinting in the smoky light. Civilians screamed, some dropping to their knees in prayer, others clutching their children and begging for mercy. Peter's spider sense flared so violently, he almost staggered. The danger wasn't coming from outside the walls this time. It was right here, right now. No, Peter shouted, stepping forward. The Space Marines shifted to block him, their bolters rising in perfect unison. The Inquisitor spoke again, his tone cold and final. Peter's gut twisted. He didn't need a translator to know what was about to happen. This wasn't an evacuation, it was an extermination. The Imperium couldn't afford to feed or shelter these people, so they would cleanse the district instead. Efficient, logical, monstrous. Memories crashed through his mind. Faces he'd saved back home, people pulled from burning buildings, lives changed because he'd refused to give up. He remembered Uncle Ben's words, Aunt May's unwavering faith in him, the responsibility that had always guided his every choice. He couldn't let this happen, not while he still drew breath. He moved before they could react, a blur of motion propelled by rage and desperation. He leapt over the Marines, landing between the guardsmen and the civilians. His voice thundered across the plaza, raw with emotion. Don't do this. They didn't understand the words, but they understood his intent. The Inquisitor's eyes widened, and he shouted an order. The Space Marines surged forward. Bolter fire erupted, explosive rounds tearing through the air. Peter's body moved on instinct, his enhanced senses guiding him through the hail of death. He grabbed two heavy weapons and crushed them like tin cans, his strength terrifying even to himself. The guardsmen stumbled back in confusion and fear, their formation breaking. The civilians scattered, screaming, fleeing through narrow alleys and broken streets. Peter shielded as many as he could, taking hits that would have torn lesser beings apart. His armor cracked, blood running beneath the plates, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The Inquisitor's face twisted in fury. He raised a strange device, chanting words that burned in Peter's ears. Suddenly the chains of psychic energy snapped back around Peter's limbs, dragging him to his knees. Pain lanced through his body, his vision dimming. No! Peter roared, straining against the invisible bonds. His spider sense screamed, not just in warning but in anguish. The whispers returned, louder than ever. You cannot save them all. Every choice weaves another strand of the web. Pull too hard, and the web collapses. Peter clenched his teeth, refusing to listen. With a final desperate surge, he broke free of the psychic grip. The backlash sent a shockwave through the plaza, toppling guardsmen and cracking the stone beneath him. The Inquisitor stumbled, clearly shocked by the display of raw power. Peter staggered to his feet, chest heaving. Around him, the civilians vanished into the smoke, escaping for now, but the cost was clear. Dozens lay dead, or dying, their blood soaking into the streets. The guardsmen stared at him with a mixture of awe and hatred, their weapons trembling. The Inquisitor raised his hand, and the Space Marines leveled their bolters.
Peter froze, his muscles coiled. He could fight them, maybe even win. But if he killed them, he would become exactly what they believed him to be, a monster. The Inquisitor's voice cut through the tense silence, calm and calculating. He spoke, a single phrase. The Marines hesitated, then lowered their weapons. Peter realized, with a sinking feeling, that this wasn't mercy. It was strategy. The Inquisitor had seen his power firsthand. Now he would use it. As soldiers dragged away the wounded and the dead, Peter stood alone in the center of the plaza, his body aching, his soul heavier than ever. He had saved lives, yes, but at what cost? Above the smog-choked city, the warp storm pulsed brighter as if mocking his choice. Peter looked up at the swirling sky and whispered to himself, "If this is what it means to be a hero here, I don't know if I can pay the price." The night after the massacre was unnaturally still, as if the city itself held its breath. Peter sat alone atop a half-collapsed spire, his body heavy with exhaustion, his thoughts heavier still. Below, the hive smoldered in ruin. Fires burned in broken towers, their glow muted by the oppressive fog that never seemed to lift. Somewhere far off, a bell tolled, slow and mournful, its sound swallowed almost immediately by the endless sprawl of stone and steel. He stared down at his hands, still stained with blood that wouldn't wash away. No matter how hard he scrubbed, it clung to him, a reminder of what he'd done and what he couldn't prevent. The civilians he'd saved earlier had escaped the square, but not all of them had made it. Their screams still echoed in his ear. And worse, the guardsmen's expressions haunted him, the mixture of awe, fear and hate. He wasn't their hero. He wasn't even a soldier to them. He was a weapon, barely controlled, a beast to be unleashed and then caged again. His spider sense tingled softly, a subtle hum beneath his skin. It wasn't danger exactly, more like unease. A warning that something nearby wasn't what it seemed. He tensed, scanning the rooftops. Nothing moved, yet the feeling grew stronger, a whispering pressure at the edge of his mind. "You think you can save them," a voice hissed, not external but inside his skull. "But what happens when they see what you truly are?" Peter's breath caught. The voice wasn't like the psychic chains that had bound him before. This was different, intimate, mocking. "Get out of my head," he snarled, clutching his temples. The whispering laugh was cold. "You are ours. You were always ours. The warp claimed you the moment you fell through the storm. Every act of defiance, every noble choice, it feeds us. You cannot escape the web. His pulse thundered. The visions from the Black Library surged back, the crimson thread connecting him to the storm, the endless war between gods he didn't understand. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if he was already compromised, if every action he took was part of some greater plan laid by beings he couldn't even comprehend. A heavy clang echoed behind him. Peter spun, instinctively crouching low, ready to strike. A figure stepped into the dim light, a space marine, its armor etched with intricate scripture and purity seals fluttering in the faint breeze. Its skull-faced helmet gleamed as it bowed slightly, almost respectfully. Peter didn't relax. "What do you want?" The marine didn't speak his language, but it didn't need to. It simply extended a hand, gesturing for Peter to follow. The meaning was clear. The Inquisitor was summoning him. Again, Peter hesitated, his spider sense flaring sharper now. This wasn't just unease, it was danger imminent and close. His gaze flicked to the shadows around the base of the spire. There, movement, subtle and wrong. Figures shifting in ways that didn't match the steady, disciplined rhythm of Imperial troops. Their outlines blurred at the edges, as if reality itself rejected them. Chaos cultists. Before he could shout a warning, they struck. The first wave burst from the darkness, their bodies twisted by mutation, their weapons a grotesque mix of jagged metal and bone. Their war cries were half human, half animal. The lone space marine roared, his bolter thundering as explosive rounds tore through the attackers. Peter leapt into the fray, his body moving faster than thought. He slammed into two cultists, his fists a blur of motion. Bones cracked, flesh tore, but more poured in to replace them. These weren't ordinary insurgents. They moved with fanatical purpose, chanting in a guttural tongue that made Peter's skin crawl. In the chaos, Peter's spider sense pulsed in jagged spikes, pulling his attention toward the rear of the cultist rank. A figure stood there, unmoving amidst the carnage. It was robed and masked, its form wreathed in a faint flickering aura of sickly light. Even at this distance, Peter felt its presence like a claw scraping at his mind. As he locked eyes, or what passed for eyes, with the figure, the whispers in his head surged to a scream. "There you are," the voice purred. "Our precious key." Peter faltered for half a second, and a cultist's blade raked across his side. Pain flared, but his new physiology healed almost instantly, knitting the wound closed before blood could spill. He roared and hurled the attacker into a collapsing wall. The space marine fought like a force of nature, but even he was slowing under the relentless tide. Peter knew they couldn't hold out forever. With a final burst of speed, he launched himself toward the robed figure. The cultists seemed almost to part for him, their chanting rising in pitch. The figure raised a hand. Reality bent. Peter slammed into an invisible wall mid-leap and was thrown backward. His body hit the ground hard enough to crack stone. The psychic pressure that had been whispering at the edges of his mind now crushed down with full force. "You are the thread that will open the way," the figure intoned, its voice echoing both aloud and inside his skull. "The storm brought you here for a purpose. You will usher him through, whether you wish it or not." Peter forced himself to his knees, his breath ragged. "I don't know what you're talking about," he growled, "but I'm not your key. I'm nobody's weapon." The figure's laughter was like broken glass. "You think you have a choice? Look around you. Even now, the Imperium molds you, shaping you into their perfect killer. When they are done, you will serve them, or you will serve us. It matters little. The web always claims its prey." With a sudden motion, the figure vanished, dissolving into smoke and shadow. The cultists broke, fleeing into the ruins, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. The pressure in Peter's mind lessened, but didn't disappear. The whispers remained, quieter now, like a serpent coiled in the darkness. The space marine limped toward Peter, his armor scorched and pitted. He placed a heavy hand on Peter's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their survival. Peter stared into the darkness, where the robed figure had vanished, dread pooling in his gut. The attack hadn't been random. It had been a message, a warning. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside them, inside him. And if he couldn't find a way to resist, the entire galaxy would pay the price. The first bells rang at dawn, their deep sonorous notes vibrating through the shattered hive, like the heartbeat of some vast, dying beast. Peter had not slept. He had spent the night pacing the narrow confines of the sanctum chamber high within the cathedral fortress, his mind gnawed by the cultist's words. The thread that will open the way. Even now, the whisper of that voice coiled in the back of his skull like a parasite. It was quieter than before, but no less insidious, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. When the final bell tolled, the city awoke in a frenzy. Civilians were herded into subterranean vaults by squads of guardsmen, their cries lost beneath the drone of vox horns blaring commands. The streets were barricaded with crude fortifications of scrap metal and burnt-out vehicles. Everywhere Peter looked, Imperial troops moved with grim purpose, checking weapons, reciting battle prayers, and preparing for what was coming. Sanctus Spira, the heart of the hive, was more than a fortress, it was a symbol. Towering spires rose into the smog-choked sky, each crowned with statues of saints and martyrs, whose blank stone faces stared down at the city below. The cathedral's central tower was visible, even through the smoke, its silhouette like a spear thrust toward heaven. It was here the Imperium had chosen to make their stand, and here the cultists intended to tear reality apart. The Inquisitor stood at the highest balcony, his black robes fluttering in the hot wind. His face was as impassive as stone as he surveyed the mustering forces. Peter joined him reluctantly, his own form now clad in incomplete but functional armor. It wasn't a true Space Marine suit. There hadn't been time for the full rites of implantation, but the Adeptus Mechanicus had forged something that matched his physiology. It felt strange, like wearing someone else's skin, but it allowed him to move with lethal precision while offering protection from the horrors ahead. Below them, the city shuddered. A low, rumbling sound rose from the horizon, accompanied by an unnatural crimson glow that painted the smoke like blood. Peter's enhanced senses picked up a scent that turned his stomach rote and sulfur mixed with something metallic and wrong. The warp storm was close, its presence pressing against the edges of reality like a fist against thin glass. Then came the roar. The cultist horde surged from the ruins in a wave of bodies, their howls a cacophony of madness. Twisted shapes moved among them, mutants with extra limbs, beasts whose hides were covered in writhing sigils, and towering champions clad in blackened armor, adorned with spikes and trophies. Behind them strode Chaos Marines, their bulk rivaling the Loyalist Astartes, their eyes glowing with warp fire. The first barrage struck Sanctus Spira's outer defenses like a thunderclap. Explosions ripped through barricades, sending men and debris flying. Guardsmen screamed prayers as they opened fire, their lazans hissing streams of light into the oncoming tide. The Space Marines roared their own hymns of war, their bolters booming like rolling thunder. The battle had begun. Peter leapt from the balcony into the fray, landing amidst a knot of advancing cultists, his fists shattered bone and steel alike, his movements a blur of speed and precision. For a fleeting moment it felt almost like home, swinging through the streets of New York, stopping criminals before they could hurt anyone. But this was no street fight. Here, every strike was a kill. Every failure meant another life lost. He moved through the battlefield like a living storm, intercepting Chaos champions before they could break the line, shielding guardsmen from blasts of warp energy with his own body. The new armor amplified his strength, letting him hurl entire squads of cultists aside. But it was never enough. No matter how many he felled, more came, endless and unrelenting. Above the chaos, the Inquisitor's voice boomed through vox speakers. Though Peter couldn't understand the words, he grasped their intent. Hold the line at all costs. Sanctus Spira could not fall. The enemy's true goal revealed itself hours into the siege. While the Imperials fought tooth and nail at the gates, the robed figure from before appeared atop a distant spire, flanked by two massive Chaos Marines. It raised its arms, chanting in a language that made Peter's head ache. The sky tore open. A rift yawned above the cathedral, spilling raw warp energy like a wound in reality. Through it came visions of impossible horror, shapes too vast to comprehend,
shadows that moved with cruel purpose. The crimson thread inside Peter's mind pulsed violently, almost driving him to his knees. He understood then, this was the summoning ritual. The storm itself was being funneled through him, through the connection that had dragged him into this galaxy. "Open the way," the whisper hissed. "Be the bridge." "No," Peter roared, his voice lost amid the din. He fought his way toward the spire, each step a battle against both cultists and his own weakening resolve. The closer he came, the stronger the psychic pull became. His spider sense, once his ally, now screamed against him, distorting his perception of the battlefield. Allies and enemies blurred together, and he nearly struck down a guardsman before catching himself at the last instant. The Inquisitor must have realized the danger. Over the Vox he barked new orders. The Loyalist Space Marines shifted formation, carving a path for Peter to reach the spire. They moved with machine-like precision, their bolters creating corridors of death through the enemy ranks. Even so, the cost was horrific. Marines fell one by one, their armored bodies crushed beneath waves of cultists, or consumed by warp fire. At last Peter reached the base of the spire. The robed figures chanting reached a crescendo. The rift above widened, the sky bleeding red and black. A massive clawed hand began to emerge, its talons wreathed in flames that weren't fire. Peter's vision narrowed. This was it, the heart of the web. If that thing came through, there would be no stopping it. He hurled himself upward, leaping higher than he ever had before. His armored gauntlets found purchase on the spire's cracked stone, propelling him skyward. The robed figure turned toward him, its masked face unreadable. With a flick of its hand, a wave of psychic force slammed into Peter, nearly tearing him free of the wall. He clung desperately, his fingers digging gouges into the stone. The voice in his head became a roar now, promising power, promising release, promising a way home if only he gave in. He forced himself onward, step by agonizing step, until at last he reached the summit. The figure raised its staff, chanting the final words of the ritual. Peter struck, his fist driving through the staff and into the figure's chest. The psychic backlash was like a sun exploding inside his skull. The rift above shuddered, its edges collapsing inward. The clawed hand dissolved into smoke, its unearthly howl fading into silence. As the figure crumpled, dead or banished, Peter swayed on the spire's peak. The battlefield below was a maelstrom of fire and blood, but for the first time, the tide seemed to falter. Chaos forces wavered, their cohesion broken without their leader's will. Peter stared at the shrinking rift, his body trembling. He had won for now, but as the last remnants of the warp storm faded, he knew this victory was fragile, and the war was far from over. And somewhere deep inside, the whispering voice laughed softly, as if mocking his defiance. Peter collapsed to his knees atop the shattered spire, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. His armor was cracked and smoking, the once pristine plates dented and blackened from the psychic backlash. His fists trembled, still slick with the blood of the robed figure he had struck down. Below him, the battlefield was chaos. Imperial banners swayed amidst clouds of ash and fire, and the enemy forces, scattered in disarray. For the first time since the storm had brought him here, the city was silent except for the moans of the wounded, and the tolling of victory bells that sounded more like funeral chime. The rift above him shuddered and closed fully, leaving behind only a smear of unnatural crimson light that slowly faded into the choking smog. The massive clawed hand that had threatened to emerge was gone, but the memory of it clung to Peter's mind like a fever dream. He didn't know what had almost crossed into this world, only that it had been vast and hungry, and that the crimson thread inside him had been its key. His spider sense hummed weakly now, not in warning but in exhausted echoes, like a broken instrument. For the first time, Peter was grateful for its silence. The constant psychic pressure had been unbearable, and even a brief respite felt like a blessing. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, willing his thoughts to still, but the silence didn't last. From the ruins below, a single pained voice rose above the others, a child's cry, a thin, wavering sound that pierced through the smoke and the ringing in Peter's ears. His eyes snapped open. Without hesitation, He leapt from the spire, landing amidst the rubble with a thunderous crash.
The impact jarred his bones, but he barely felt it. He followed the sound through broken streets until he found her, a little girl huddled beneath a fallen statue, her tiny hands gripping a scrap of tattered cloth with the double-headed eagle emblazoned on it. Peter crouched beside her, his heart aching. She flinched at the sight of him, shrinking back as if he were another monster. Slowly, carefully, he removed his helmet, letting her see his face. "Hey," he said softly, his voice breaking. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl didn't understand his words, but something in his tone must have reached her. Her sobs quieted, and she let him lift her into his arms. She was impossibly light, more bone than flesh, her wide eyes reflecting the firelit ruin around them. Peter held her close, shielding her from the worst of the smoke as he carried her toward the nearest group of guardsmen. They took the child from him with silent efficiency, their expressions grim. One of them, an older soldier with a scar running down his cheek, saluted Peter in a gesture that felt both respectful and wary. Peter nodded back, then turned away before they could see the tears burning in his eyes. The Inquisitor awaited him at the steps of the cathedral fortress, flanked by 2 space marines, whose armor bore fresh scars from the battle. The Inquisitor's face was as unreadable as ever, though his eyes burned with a calculating intensity. He gestured for Peter to follow him inside. The cathedral's interior was a place of shadows and echoes, its towering statues and stained glass windows now cracked and darkened by smoke. The air smelled of incense mixed with blood and Prometheus. In the center of the hall, a massive map of the hive and surrounding territories was spread across a stone table. Officers clustered around it, speaking in low, urgent tones. As Peter approached, the room fell silent. Every eye turned toward him. Some gazes held reverence, others suspicion, and a few open hatred. They all knew what he was, the stranger, the outsider, the living weapon that had turned the tide of battle. The Inquisitor raised a hand, speaking in his sharp, commanding voice. Though Peter couldn't understand the words, he grasped their meaning. The battle was over, but the war was not. The enemy had been driven back, but they were not defeated. The warp storm had only been delayed, not dispersed, and at the center of it all was Peter himself. As the Inquisitor spoke, Peter's mind began to drift, his vision blurred, and suddenly he wasn't standing in the cathedral anymore. He was swinging through the canyons of New York, the wind whipping past his mask, the familiar rhythm of webs striking glass and steel. For a moment, he could almost hear the distant wail of police sirens, the laughter of kids playing in the street. He reached out instinctively, and the vision shattered like glass. He was back in the cathedral, the Inquisitor staring at him sharply. Peter staggered, clutching his head. The whispers returned, softer now, almost seductive. "This is not your world," they murmured. "You could return to the one you love. Leave this place of ashes and madness. All you need do is let go." Peter's breath caught. Images flooded his mind. Aunt May's kind smile, MJ's fiery laugh, the familiar glow of Times Square at night. Home, it was so close he could almost touch it. The thread inside him pulsed, a lifeline, leading back to everything he'd lost. But then another image intruded, the little girl beneath the statue, trembling in fear, the guardsmen chanting their battle prayers even as they died, the endless faces of people who couldn't fight back, who had no one to save them but him. His hands clenched. "I can't," he whispered. "Not like this." The whispers hissed in frustration, then faded, leaving only the echo of their temptation. Peter sank to one knee, sweat beading on his brow. He understood now. The warp wasn't just a battlefield, it was a web of lies and choices, pulling at every heart and mind it touched, and he was caught at its center. The Inquisitor's hand came down heavily on Peter's shoulder. The meaning was clear. There would be no retreat, no escape. The Imperium needed him. This world needed him, whether he wanted it or not. Peter rose slowly, meeting the Inquisitor's gaze. He didn't have words to bridge the gulf between them, but he didn't need to. His decision was written in his stance, in the set of his jaw. He would fight, not because they demanded it, but because it was the only way he could live with himself. As the cathedral doors opened and the dawn's sickly light spilled inside, Peter looked out over the broken city. The crimson thread still pulsed faintly within his chest, a reminder of the storm and the enemy that had not been defeated. This was not the end of the web, it was only another strand, and he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that before this war was done, the web would claim him completely. The sky above Sanctis Spira bled crimson as the storm gathered strength once more, roiling like a living wound. Jagged bolts of unnatural lightning split the clouds, striking the Gothic spires and shattering them into cascades of burning stone. The cathedral fortress groaned as if in pain, its towers trembling beneath the weight of the unreality pressing in. Peter stood on the shattered battlements, staring into the heart of the storm, his fists clenching inside his gauntlets. The crimson thread in his chest pulsed in time with the storm, each beat a painful reminder that this was all tied to him. Below, the hive was in chaos. The surviving Imperial forces scrambled to prepare for another assault, their banners torn, their numbers decimated. Guardsmen formed shaky lines amidst the rubble, chanting prayers that mixed with the mechanical drone of the Vox horn. The Space Marines moved among them like silent, implacable giants, their bolters reloaded, their armor smeared with gore and soot. The Inquisitor barked orders, his voice sharp as a blade, but there was no hiding the tension in his eye. He knew, as they all did, that this next attack would not be a mere horde of cultists. This time, something far worse was coming through. Peter's spider sense surged violently, a dizzying crescendo that almost drove him to his knee. His vision blurred, the edges of the world fraying like torn silk. The whispers returned, louder than ever, clawing at his thoughts. "We are here. We have always been here. You are ours, little spider. Our perfect vessel." He staggered back, clutching his head. "No," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You don't control me. You will." The voices purred. "The web does not break. It only expands." The Inquisitor appeared at his side, one hand gripping Peter's shoulder, steadying him. The man's cold gaze bored into him, searching for cracks. Without a word, he pointed toward the storm. Peter followed his gesture and saw it, a shape moving within the crimson maelstrom. At first, it was only a silhouette, vast and indistinct. Then it resolved into something far more terrible. A daemon prince stepped forth from the rift. It was immense, towering over the battlefield like a living nightmare. Its body was a grotesque fusion of muscle, bone, and armor, each limb tipped with talons that glistened with ichor. Wings of tattered flesh unfurled from its back, their span blotting out the broken sun. Its face was a mask of shifting features, half human and half beast, crowned with curling horns. When it roared, the sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating through the stone, through flesh, through the soul itself. The very air warped around it. Guardsmen screamed and fell to their knees, clutching their heads as blood streamed from their eyes. Even the Space Marines faltered, their disciplined ranks wavering beneath the creature's psychic assault. Peter's legs moved before he could think. He leapt from the battlements, landing amidst the frontline defenders with a shockwave that cracked the ground. The daemon's gaze fixed on him instantly, and Peter felt the crimson thread inside him tighten painfully, like a leash. "My vessel," the daemon hissed directly into his mind. "The key to my ascension. You will open the way fully, and through you I shall devour this world." Peter forced himself upright, his breathing ragged. "You want me," he shouted, his voice raw. "Come and get me." The daemon lunged, moving with impossible speed for its size. Peter dodged aside at the last instant, the creature's claws gouging trenches in the ground where he had stood. He countered with a powerful strike to its side, his enhanced strength driving it back a step. The impact felt like punching a mountain. Pain flared up his arm, but he ignored it, pressing the attack. The battle became a blur of motion and destruction. Peter darted around the daemon like a living shadow, striking its limbs, leaping to avoid its crushing blows. Each strike echoed like thunder, shattering stone and flesh alike. His spider sense guided him through the chaos, but the connection to the warp made every warning a scream of agony in his skull. Around them, the battle raged. Guardsmen fired desperately into the swarming cultists that poured from the rift behind their master. Space Marines engaged Chaos Marines in brutal duels, their bolters and chainswords carving through flesh and steel. The Inquisitor directed the defense with ruthless precision, his commands cutting through the dun, but Peter barely saw any of it. His entire world had narrowed to the daemon before him,
The creature laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "You fight well, little spider, but you fight alone. Even now, your precious Imperium prepares to turn on you. They will call you heretic, mutant, xena. They will burn you when your usefulness ends. Why suffer for them when you could rule beside me?" Visions crashed through Peter's mind, images of himself standing beside the daemon, clad in black armor, entire worlds kneeling before him. Aunt May, MJ, everyone he'd ever loved, alive again by the daemon's power. It was intoxicating, terrifying. He faltered for a heartbeat, and the daemon struck. A massive claw slammed into his chest, hurling him through a ruined wall. He hit the ground hard, his breath exploding from his lungs. His vision swam. The crimson thread burned inside him, pulling, urging him to give in. Then he heard another voice, not a whisper, but a memory, Uncle Ben's words. Steady and unwavering, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Peter staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his lip. "You don't get it," he snarled, his voice shaking with fury. "I don't fight for power, I fight for them, for every person who can't fight back, and no matter what world I'm in, that never changes." He leapt, faster than the daemon could react, driving his armored fist into its chest. The blow cracked its warped ribs, sending it reeling. Peter didn't stop. He climbed the creature like a living skyscraper, striking again and again, each blow fueled by every loss, every choice, every life depending on him. The daemon roared, trying to shake him off, but Peter wrapped his arms around its throat and pulled with all his strength. His muscles burned, his armor cracked, but he didn't let go. With a final guttural scream, he tore the creature's head free. The daemon's body convulsed, then collapsed, dissolving into black smoke. The rift above shrieked and began to implode, sucking the remaining cultists into its depths. The battlefield fell eerily silent as the unnatural light faded. Peter stood amidst the ruins, swaying on his feet. The crimson thread in his chest pulsed once more, then quieted. He had severed the daemon's hold for now. Around him, guardsmen and space marines stared in stunned silence. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others crossed themselves, whispering words of reverence and fear.
Peter looked down at his hands, shaking and blood-stained. The battle was over, but the war inside him had only begun. And in the deep, echoing silence of his mind, he thought he heard the daemon's laughter, faint but unbroken, promising that this was not the end. The smoke lingered long after the last cultist had fallen, curling in ghostly tendrils through the shattered streets of Sanctus Spira. The city lay broken, its spires cracked and blackened, its people scattered or dead. Peter stood at the center of the devastation, his body aching, his armor scorched and barely holding together. The daemon's remains had vanished into nothing, leaving behind only the stink of sulfur and the faint hum of warp taint that refused to dissipate. The guardsmen worked in silence, dragging corpses into piles, their faces blank with exhaustion. There were no cheers, no celebration. Victory here was only the absence of annihilation, and even that felt temporary. The surviving space marines moved like towering statues, collecting their fallen brothers with ritualistic precision. Their bolters were slung across their backs, but their every motion radiated cold, implacable readiness, as though another battle might erupt at any moment. Peter watched them, his heart heavy. These warriors had fought beside him, bled beside him, and yet their eyes never truly met his. He saw no camaraderie in their gazes, only calculation, suspicion, and a distant, almost reverent fear. He wasn't one of them. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how many times he risked his life for their cause, he would always be the outsider, the anomaly, the weapon they could not fully control. The Inquisitor approached, his black robe streaked with soot and ash. His expression was unreadable, but his presence radiated authority like a physical force. 2 Marines flanked him, their armor marked with fresh purity seals. The Inquisitor halted before Peter, looking him over as though inspecting a relic. Then he spoke a single word, sharp, command. Peter didn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear. Come with me. They led him through the ruined cathedral fortress, past broken altars and shattered stained glass windows. Fires smoldered in the corners, casting flickering shadows across the wall. The halls were eerily silent except for the echo of their footsteps. At last they entered a chamber deep beneath the cathedral, its walls lined with ancient relics and tattered banners. In the center stood a massive golden statue of a figure seated upon a throne, its features weathered by time, but unmistakably regal. Peter stared up at it, his breath catching. Even without knowing the history, he felt the weight of this place. This was no mere idol. This was a symbol of everything the Imperium fought for, everything they killed for. The two-headed eagle gleamed faintly in the torchlight, watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. The Inquisitor began to speak, his tone reverent but edged with iron. His words flowed like a sermon, rising and falling in a rhythm that stirred the guardsmen kneeling nearby. Peter caught fragments of meaning from his tone and gestures. This was judgment. The Inquisitor gestured to the city above, then to Peter. His voice sharpened, becoming almost accusatory. The soldiers murmured, their faces a mix of awe and fear. Peter felt their eyes burning into him, weighing his fate. They had seen him tear through enemies like a force of nature. They had seen him destroy a daemon prince with his bare hands. To them, that power was either divine or heretical. Peter took a step back, his pulse quickening. "Wait a second," he said, knowing they couldn't understand him but needing to speak anyway. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to be here. I just wanted to help." His voice broke on the last word. The Inquisitor's gaze was merciless. He raised a small device, a relic-like pistol, etched with sacred runes. The room fell silent. Even the Space Marines seemed to tense, their hands hovering near their weapons. Peter understood immediately. This was the moment of judgment. Live or die, savior or threat. His spider sense flared, urging him to move, to strike, to escape. But he stood still, his chest heaving. If he fought now, if he killed them, he would prove every fear they had about him. He would become the monster the cultists had promised. Slowly, Peter dropped to one knee. He bowed his head, his voice shaking. "I'm not your enemy," he whispered. "I'm not your weapon, either. I'm just a guy trying to do what's right." The Inquisitor's finger hovered over the trigger. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, without warning, he lowered the weapon. A single word rang out, final and absolute. The guardsmen exhaled in unison, some sagging with relief, others glaring with renewed suspicion. The Space Marines remained impassive, though Peter thought he detected a faint shift in their stance, as if even they had doubted the Inquisitor's decision. The Inquisitor turned sharply and strode away, leaving Peter kneeling before the golden statue. No explanation, no praise, only the cold reality of survival. Peter rose slowly, his body trembling with adrenaline. He looked up at the statue, searching for meaning in its worn features. Back home, he'd always believed in second chances, in redemption. Here, he wasn't sure such things existed. Here, mercy felt like another kind of weapon, wielded by those with the power to grant or deny it. The crimson thread in his chest pulsed faintly, a reminder that his role in this war was far from over. He turned toward the exit, knowing the Imperium's silence spoke louder than any words. He had been spared today, but not forgiven. And somewhere beyond the storm-choked sky, other eyes were watching, waiting for the moment he faltered. The war for his soul was only just beginning. The storm had finally broken, not with sunlight or warmth, but with a grey and bitter calm that settled over Sanctus Spira like the breath of a dying god. The fires still smoldered in the streets, the cathedral fortress still bled incense and ash, but the relentless howling of the warp had faded to a distant murmur. For the first time since his arrival, Peter felt the weight of silence across the city, and it was heavier than any roar of battle. He stood alone, atop the fractured walls, his armor blackened, his body aching, his mind torn between exhaustion and the restless energy coursing through his altered veins. Below him, the Imperium worked without pause. Guardsmen cleared the dead with grim efficiency. Tech priests chanted over broken war machines, their voices metallic and discordant. Servitors dragged debris into heaps while the cathedral's bells tolled their hollow victory. It was the aftermath of survival, not triumph. The Inquisitor had not spoken to him since the moment in the relic. Peter didn't know if he had been spared out of trust, fear, or cold calculation. Perhaps it didn't matter. The man's silence felt like the city's silence, a verdict without words. He was alive, because he was useful, nothing more. The Space Marines moved among the ruins like walking monuments, their armor gleaming dully in the dim light. Some bore the scars of the battle, entire pauldrons scorched away, or helmets split by daemon claws. They never slowed, never faltered. Peter watched them, and wondered if they had ever been men, or if they had always been something more, or something less. He touched his own chest where the mechanicus implants pulsed beneath his skin, alien organs whispering in rhythms his heart had never known before. How much of him was still Peter Parker? How much of him now belonged to this place? The question lingered as he gazed toward the horizon. The warp storm was gone, yet its absence felt unnatural, like the eye of a greater tempest waiting to close. He remembered the Daemon Prince's final laughter, echoing inside his skull, as its body dissolved into smoke. That sound hadn't been defeat, it had been promise. The crimson thread in his chest pulsed faintly. It had grown quieter since the battle, no longer burning like fire in his veins. But it remained, tethering him to something far beyond the walls of Sanctus Spira. The Black Library's vision haunted him, the vast web of fate, the strands connecting worlds and lives, and wars without end. He had severed one strand when he killed the daemon, but the web itself remained, and somewhere, far across the galaxy, other things were pulling at it. A cluster of guardsmen passed below, their eyes flicking toward him before quickly turning away. He could read the fear in their faces. To them, he was no longer a man at all. He had torn through cultists and demons like a storm given flesh. He had survived wounds that should have killed him, struck down a creature of the warp with his bare hands, and walked away breathing. That wasn't victory to them. That was sorcery, heresy. The Imperium did not suffer mutants or witches to live, and Peter Parker was now something worse than both. Bootsteps approached across the broken wall. Peter turned to see the Inquisitor standing there, his black robes tattered but his posture as rigid as ever. Behind him loomed two Space Marines, silent and impassive. The Inquisitor studied Peter for a long moment before speaking. The words were low, measured, but Peter caught their edge. He didn't need a translator to hear the warning beneath them. He was being given a choice, or the illusion of one. Fight for the Imperium, on worlds whose names he didn't know, against enemies he couldn't imagine, or refuse, and become the enemy himself. Peter almost laughed. Back home, choices had been simple: save people because it was right, because that was what heroes did. Here, nothing was simple. Every act of mercy felt like blasphemy to the Imperium. Every life saved was weighed against the cold arithmetic of survival. And somewhere in the shadows, the warp watched and waited, offering power, offering escape, offering him everything he'd lost if he would only surrender. He didn't answer the Inquisitor right away. His eyes drifted once more to the horizon where the storm had been. He thought of Aunt May's voice, of MJ's smile, of the familiar chaos of New York traffic, and the glow of city lights after rain. Home felt so close sometimes, like he could almost reach out and swing back into that life. But the thread in his chest always pulled him back. Maybe there was no going back. At length, he nodded once to the Inquisitor, not in obedience, not in surrender, but in grim acknowledgement. If this galaxy wanted him to fight, he would fight, but on his terms, not as their weapon, not as their martyr. The Inquisitor studied him for a moment longer, then signaled the Marines. They turned and left without a word, heading toward the waiting transport. Somewhere beyond the hive, new wars were already burning. Peter remained on the wall a while longer, watching the gray sky as the wind carried ash through the broken spire. The crimson thread inside him pulsed again, faint but steady, stretching out into the stars where things moved in darkness and waited for him to falter. He didn't know if he was the spider caught in the web, or the one spinning it. Maybe it didn't matter, because either way, he could feel it tightening, and he knew the war wasn't over. It had only just begun.